Hi everyone, welcome. Yeah, that's a sunflower. No sunflower seeds in it. It's compliments of my buddy. I got a few of these, and the bin that I'm going to be feeding today, the one that's already here on the bench in front of me, was fed a couple of these last time we checked in on it 12 days ago. So one curiosity that I'm interested in checking in on is how these sunflowers fared over the past 12 days since they were last fed. Today they're going to get a little bit more of a conventional feeding, stuff out of my freezer. It's mostly fruits and veggies. Got some beans, I got some strawberry, banana peels, old piece of watermelon, and a couple unconventional things. I wanted to make myself a sandwich yesterday, and the Swiss cheese was so brittle it broke in my hand. And I figured it's probably a little too dried out, maybe a little too old to be eaten by humans. But I figured it was good enough for the worms, so I threw it into my freezer. Not that it had to be frozen. The only thing that's not frozen here are these coffee filters, which we can use as supplementary bedding, and these two slices of what appears to be American cheese, but it's actually a non-dairy cheese, which I didn't know it was that. Somebody gave it to me, and I thought to myself, oh, I can make grilled cheese, I can make cheese omelets, I can make all these yummy foods. And when I tasted this stuff, it just really didn't taste like cheese. I mean, kind of seemed like cheese, but didn't really taste quite right. So I just figured, you know what? I don't think I'm going to eat much more of that stuff. It doesn't really appeal to me. But if the worms will eat it, that's cool. Maybe I've got some sort of a supplementary material to give them, other than the ordinary kitchen scraps that they normally receive. Now, our last check-in with this system here, we included a good amount of leafy material across the top. I also sprinkled the leafy material on top with some of my worm chow, which we can include in today's feeding as well. It does seem like it spurred on a good bit of activity because there are a little bit of leftovers from the leafy material. These outer edges where there might have been a little bit more airflow than in the middle underneath that plastic covering. Still seeing some leftover bits of leaves, but most of the leaves that were in the center of the bin are, for the most part, nibbled down to little itsy bitsy fragments. We could slide some of this leafy material that covered the top surface off to the side and sort of remove the camouflage, shielding us from a good view of the contents of the bin. I think once you start moving stuff aside, that's when you start getting a better sense of how things in the system really look without actually digging down into it yet, which we're going to do momentarily. So I guess besides the novelty feeding item of sunflowers last time, there was also, you can already see a hint of it right here. This is a quarantine bag. It's just a plastic mesh bag in which I've been quarantining some material which just has shown virtually no signs of breakdown. And the stuff actually came from the previous system that these worms used to occupy way back when. I mean, the system is now 197 days of age, which means that the material was already in the previous system that these worms occupied. And I just figured, hey, since the stuff looked like it wasn't quite broken down yet, we'd give it a little bit more time in here. But check-in after check-in, time after time, we never see any deterioration of the material. So many theories have abounded. Abounded? Is that the right word? Theories abound of what this springy, translucent material I found in this casting collection is. But I think I'm done looking at it. I'm kind of uninterested in trying to wait out its eventual outcome in terms of whether it will or won't break down in the worm bins. I think if it was on its road to being broken down, then we'd already see some signs of that. So I think the time has come to separate that stuff from the castings that it's all blended in with. I guess here's something I was hoping not to see, is that the stuff is starting to slip through the mesh bag and contaminate this system as well. I mean, we'll leave it in here. What I thought was that we would just kind of place it out here on the corner and just put the plastic wrap that was covering this system off to the side and let this just be exposed to the air. As it dries, the worms will just exit the material, because right now it's got a nice moisture level. Worms are hanging out in it. They're completely content to be in here. But if we let it dry, I think it'll, you know, number one, give the worms a chance to leave the stuff, and then it'll also permit the castings themselves to become a lot more granular and a lot easier, that I can just shake them out of this bag and maybe in the process pick out all these things that, I mean, at the end, if all the castings do fall through, in theory this stuff will remain behind, but as we saw, it is small enough that it has the ability to slip through the holes in this mesh. So when I do finally shake the castings loose and out of that bag, I will be watching to see how much of that plastic or whatever that is comes through and try to separate it at that time. Yeah, I mean, we're approaching 200 days of age here in this system, so it's not surprising that we're seeing a system that's primarily castings. I've been pretty generous with the bedding, as I've been everywhere in all my systems. A lot of times in the past I would shy away from applying bedding to my more senior systems in the preparation for its eventual harvest, but here you can see I was even using lots of these leaves as top covering, and they always leave behind their stems. So those objects will take a little bit of time to break down. Here again, some sort of material that to me looks like it's not really an organic substance. Some sort of plastic material that's snuck in here. I just threw it into the red bag with the rest of the suspect stuff. So yeah, I mean, lots of good input from lots of people. Lots of viewers in the comments suggested what that stuff might be, and I can't confirm or deny any of the suspicions. I'm more than willing to keep all the options on the table, but I think it's also something that I just don't want to keep indulging non-stop into infinity. I believe the time has come to just make the call on that stuff and just extract it at this point, take it out of the picture. So these are the leftovers of these couple of flowers we put in here. This might be one that had broken in half. I think there were two flowers. There was a somewhat larger one, a somewhat smaller one. And as you can see, just from handling it, it's sort of, you know, falling to shreds, falling apart into little bits and pieces. I think it's just a little bit more interesting if we're careful with it and we allow it to remain intact. So we'll just return it to the feeding area as leftovers, so that maybe in our future check-ins we can continue to see how this stuff is breaking down. Or maybe at some point we'll just notice that it's been all eaten. I didn't know what to make of that stuff, whether it was going to be eaten up quickly by the worms or not, but it does seem like they're taking their sweet old time with it. Alright. What is that? Oh. This is really just a large leaf, but it already seems to be see-through. The only parts of the leaf that still remain are all those little tiny veins within the leafy material, but they've nibbled away all the softer stuff in between. It's pretty interesting to see when you can catch a leaf like that in mid-breakdown, watching the worms nibble it away into worm compost. But they always go for the soft stuff first, and they'll get it all, but when you catch it midway through, you get to see that interesting structure of the leaf with part of it already nibbled away. So let's see, we've already opened up a pretty good size hole here into which we could drop today's feeding. And we've also given ourselves a good bit of real estate too by extracting that large red mesh bag full of mostly castings, but also that questionable material that I'd like to separate. So hopefully by the next time we check in here, after maybe giving it a week or so of just sitting out on the surface to dry, maybe we'll be able to start reclaiming the castings and separating the suspect material and finally be done with that saga. So I'm thinking, let's start in with the feeding. We didn't get a chance to examine the outer edges of the bin so far, but maybe after we cover the feeding up, we'll take a peek on those outer edges to see how things are progressing. I've got my prepared bedding here on standby. We're going to drop in a little bit of that down here in the middle. If you look around the bin, you're going to see scraps of leaves all over the place, even the stuff that was used as top covering. I don't think that this system's too desperate for bedding materials, but we can use one of these coffee filters as a supplementary form of bedding too, and then start dropping in their unusual food items. So this will be the actual cheese, Swiss cheese that's made out of milk, but this is that non-dairy cheese made out of who knows what. And my hope is that the worms eat it and we don't come back in here for a little surprise later of just some uneaten junk. And I noticed that this system wasn't marking where we last fed with one of my traditional feeding zone indicators, so we'll save that one to serve that purpose at the end. I think this was like a little mini watermelon that I thought might be interesting to keep a chunk of it, but it's getting so weathered from just sitting in my freezer for so long that I thought it was time to begin actually giving it to the worms. And here we've got a banana that I guess was so bruised or whatever the case may be on this far end of it that it wasn't eaten, but all the rest of it was. And even though it was bruised and a little bit nasty, which perhaps a human person wouldn't want to eat, a worm will probably see that as a delicacy. So I got a feeling there's going to be a good amount of worm traffic drawn to that banana, so they can nibble out its insides. It's kind of cool that it's almost contained. It's still unpeeled there, so they're going to have to go in to get at the yummy food. And maybe we'll get a little bit of a worm sighting there at the end. Now I've got more of my prepared bedding that we could drop in here on top of the fresh foods. And we'll kind of treat that as a little bit of a dividing layer to place between the leftovers we found, these leftover bits of sunflower. We'll try to place them back in here carefully so that the way we leave them here is somewhat intact still. So I think that was the 1-2 pieces, and I thought there was even a couple other things here that looked like leftover chunks of sunflower. So I'll be curious to see how that stuff progresses. Here's a piece of leftover corn cob bit. There were other little bits of leftover food that we encountered on the way that I probably set aside too over here on top, but I think that's it for the leftovers. We might bump into more on the way. But let's use these mainly castings on this side to cover up with, and maybe save this leafy matter as a top covering to sprinkle across the top surface the way we did last time. I mean, last time those leaves were fresh, but since I don't have any leaves right now, I've got to go back outside to replenish my supply. We'll just recycle these old leaves here and see if we can come up with enough there to do a nice top covering. Okay, now we get to explore these outer reaches of the bin. Alrighty. I guess it is for the most part castings, but once in a while I'll also try to drop other things down into these outer edges. When I observe that it's mostly castings, I'll usually sprinkle some leafy material or other things down in there to help that other stuff also get broken down. But some of these leaf stems are so huge. Maybe it is best that it's kept low. But today, you know, I'm not going to bother with trying to sprinkle stuff down in there. I just wanted to see how it looked in terms of moisture and worm traffic and just overall health. I mean, I don't get so suspicious every time I see a piece of my own bedding here. All of this prepared shredded paper and cardboard, since that's the shape of those suspect bits of material that we've got isolated in the red plastic bag. I don't know, I guess the day will come when we'll be able to truly separate that out for good. And that might really have to be when we finally harvest these castings and move these worms off to a new system. But for now, I guess that's more sort of future stuff that still needs to be taken care of. For now, I think it's really just a matter of continuing with getting the system leveled off and covered up. Before we do that, why don't we also observe how things are progressing out on this edge as well. Now we could take this pile of preserved top layer of leaves and sprinkle it across the top. A lot of times I'll use this stuff after it's been in the bin for a while as the foundation for the current feeding. Here we just opted to introduce some nice fresh bedding into the feeding area. Just preserve that stuff so we can use it as top covering. Not bad. Stuff crumbles nicely, but it also has a pretty good moisture content to it, which is what I like to see. A lot of times you would think that a high moisture content would, cause clumping and muddiness, but I guess if you're careful and you don't let it go to that extreme, things will remain quite damp and cozy for the worms, but also at the same time remain nice and loose and crumbly, so that at no time does it, turn into a big muddy ball, which the worms can't even infiltrate or make use of or cruise around within. And then whatever's stuck in that ball of muddy stuff just sits there, going nowhere fast. So I've been on a mission to try to eliminate that from happening in my systems. I mean, it happens here and there once in a while, but I think the main remedy to that was to use lots and lots of bedding all the time if possible. And it does seem to be paying off for the most part. I've seen very little, if any, of that sort of stuff going on in my bins ever since I turned up my portion amounts of bedding in all my systems to high. So I think we're more or less done here. We're going to return all of this leafy material to cover the top surface again. Certainly not as thorough as it had been previously, but it'll be pretty good. And since I've got my worm chow here and I did want to apply it again, I'm going to apply it to all these leafy bits again like I did last time. And who knows, that could actually lead to the demise of all this leafy material. Well, I've got a feeling all those little leaf stems are going to stick around for some time. And perhaps at some point in the near future we can actually try to collect some of that up and just make sure they're not sitting out on the surface. Maybe they're going to have a better chance at getting broken down if they're, down within the material. I don't know. I'm always willing to try different things. So this coffee filter will just rest out here in the middle, showing us that the middle was where we last fed. And what I alluded to earlier was going to be, oh geez, worms are actually now, for whatever reason, trying to cruise out of this bag. So that's fine. They're welcome to do just that, but I'm going to place this bag over on the edge here now and return our plastic coverings to go right around it. Just that when I was bringing that bag over, I was making a little bit of a mess, and here's some more of those worms that I guess were coming out of their little plastic bag hangout. So here we go. It's maybe not quite as thorough as it had been in the past, but it'll do. It's doing a nice job keeping the moisture in here consistent rather than letting it dry. So that's the reason I'm still using it. A lot of times in my older systems I just try to wean myself off of using it. But if it's working well and not making things muddy, I'm okay with just keeping it around. So I guess that's it for today's check-in with these African night crawlers. getting feeding number 16 here. And, you know, since it was 12 days between check-ins last time, I don't know, seems to be a pretty good interval. I was a little surprised to find leftovers, but then again, you know, maybe sunflower just isn't really up their alley. Or maybe just it requires a little bit of, you know, more natural breakdown on its own before the worms can start taking advantage of it as food. So I guess we'll see how that stuff turns out next time we check in here, but we're done for now. We've got a few things I've got to put away and clean up, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That stuff's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.